Right, let's start today's video. Now, there will be no special picture for the thumbnail, but I figure that doesn't matter given today's topic. Today's topic is imperialism. Now, some may ask, well, why are we speaking of imperialism? Simple. It's all over the place. Imperialism in its function is basically just the exertion of one country's will over another. For example, if I walk up to your country and I say, hey, I would like you to add this to your constitution, that is exerting my will on them. That is imperialistic inherently. If I were to say, hey, I want to make a trade deal with you, accept these terms, that is imperialistic. And, in the most basic sense, if I send an army into their country and take their lands, that is imperialistic. Those are all examples of imperialism. It is the exerting of one country's will upon another. Without their consent or with it, it doesn't matter really. It is about the exerting of a will upon another. Regardless of how moral you may say it is, imperialism is just the way of life for a state. You may say, no, we can make deals, we can negotiate. With whom? To whom are you going to negotiate? Well, we'll negotiate with the level heads in their government. Who? Who in the government you wish to negotiate with is level-headed? I'm sure if you were to go to Europe or North America, you'll find quite a few, but really, what are you going to do with Russia or Africa or East Asia? Most of those countries have really big problems with corruption, lying, and deceit. Now, it's worth noting, corruption in East Asia isn't a problem as much, but they are known for having other issues. Most notably, instability, my lord. Seriously, 1 minute a guy declares himself dictator, the next he's ousted. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister gets shot a few years back, and everyone mostly remembers him from the memes. East Asia isn't exactly of a calm place when it comes to politics. But there is a simple point. How are you going to negotiate when one stray bullet can suddenly make your agreement null and void? Remember what happened in Syria. The Syrian government fell, and so Israel immediately launched an invasion to make sure their interests were secured. If it just takes one leader to fall for your state to be invaded, do you think you can afford to say, oh yeah, we'll just negotiate? No, you can't. It's the same with things like the Budapest Agreement. When you're relying on the US, Russia, and other countries to back up an agreement, that requires the governments not to shift foreign policies every so many years, which in republics does not happen. Think about it from the perspective just from the year 2000. You go from Bill Clinton and his semi-interventionist but mostly soft power focus to Bush with his far more aggressive stance, especially with the war on terror, then Obama, who was a bit mixed. He was more than willing to intervene in foreign affairs and drone strike a lot of people, but he was far more into soft power. Then you go to Trump, who tended to like pulling out. And then you have Biden, who was basically just send money. And then you have Trump again, who, while certainly not willing to use hard power this time especially, he's still generally a America First person. In just 25 years, we've gone through all of those changes in our foreign policy. Do you think, for any solitary second, that somehow we're going to maintain a steady face when it comes to negotiations? No, we're not gonna. We're gonna constantly be shifting in terms of priorities, meaning those agreements you make with us, well, let's face it, they're very likely to be interpreted a different way to where your predecessor intended for them to be interpreted, and thus completely freaking worthless. That's where imperialism comes in, because they can't really argue if you rule their government, now can they? Well, they could try, but that'd likely get crushed. And that's the thing with imperialism. It has its ups and downs, certainly, but it can be beneficial. It's also important to note it can provide a lot of economic benefits as well. Now, when a lot of people talk about imperialism, they tend to think of it as like plunder, like they just take it out the ground and leave nothing for the country they're taking from. This is not the case. For the most part, emphasis on for the most part, when a country engages in imperialism, it still invests in colonies. That's why, for example, Otto von Bismarck of Germany was not very interested in colonial projects because they cost money to set up and maintain because you have to invest in the economies of the local states to get anything out of them. Now, there is a range. On one end, you got places which are like the United States, Australia, Canada, South Africa, and Rhodesia to a lesser extent, the settler colonies, essentially. They often received a lot of investment from their motherland and often were highly developed. Now, granted, Britain's Britain, they tend to have very different policies from other countries, especially when it comes to free trade, but those were pretty well invested in countries. The US was given a lot of neglect previously, and so it had a lot of time to build up its industry. On the other end, you have those who are basically purely for resources. Most of Africa falls into this, along with British Malaya and the French Indochina. Now, even in these countries, which are purely for resource extraction, they still invested in infrastructure. It was just limited as the focus was get in, get out. For example, in the Congo, you build a rubber plantation, you build a road to the port exports it to where you need it to go, and it's done. That's all you need. You need a colonial government, of course, to keep things running, but that's basically it. The Belgian Congo is like this, so is the French Congo, really a lot of places. And then there are those in between. For example, Algeria. Although officially part of the French metropole, which meant main area, it was still treated a lot like a colony, mainly because they weren't fully French. Now, the French government did encourage them to become more French, but it didn't work out too well and it ended up failing. However, due to its connections with the metropole, despite being a place without much in terms of usefulness, excuse me on that one. Yeah, even without much in terms of usefulness beyond just making sure pirates stop raiding them, Algeria still received quite a bit in investments. For the British, that was largely the same case with India as well. The crown in the British Empire, the jewel of the British Empire, was invested in quite heavily. Now, it had its issues, plenty of them, and they generally got in less than they received at the time. However, canals, railways, roads, lots of innovations were brought to India and allowed the country to, almost reach where it is now. Because they laid the foundation for what India would build off of once it got its independence. It would have been better if they had included Pakistan and Bangladesh together, but no. Granted, that whole Hindu-Muslim thing was going to blow up like a needle on it. It was just going to blow up, let's be frank. The British made their decision. I wouldn't say it's a wise one, but they made a decision and they went through with it. Regardless, India and Pakistan and Bangladesh by extension had quite a bit of investment by the crown because it was the crown colony. It was the jewel. Now, it wasn't invested in like the settler colonies, but it was still invested in because that's what the money was. Issue was, of course, with India, it was still heavily a resource-based economy. So if they didn't produce resources, now they're kind of screwed. But this whole idea proves a point. Imperialism does not inherently have to be bad for either side. It does not have to be a win-lose situation. Technically, both sides can benefit from imperialism. You just need to know how. So, if, for example, the United States were to, invade Arabia, take over the places, and establish a new government, guaranteeing freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, right to own private property, and all other liberties that people are in their nature to have, well then, That would benefit them more than their current governments, who do not grant such rights. And the U.S. government could, through its troops, ensure that they do not need to raise their own army and can instead have private militias, whose job is to protect local neighborhoods and maintain law and order at the local level, rather than constantly trying to fight proxy wars with Iran. In such an event, Arabia would thrive. Now, they would still lose out on some sovereignty, with the whole self-determination thing being a big one, but it would be an overall net gain for their people, especially because it would allow them access to greater markets and the freedom to do as they wish, so long as they don't harm another person. And for the U.S., obviously, the benefit is free trade and having a good ally in the region. But, that being said, imperialism can also cause major issues if handled poorly. For example, if the U.S. invaded a different country, let's say, for the sake of ease, Ethiopia. They went through Eritrea, took it over, and then invaded Ethiopia. And they established a new government that's basically just a dictatorship. No one wins in that relationship. The U.S. looks diplomatically poor because they support a country which their own belief system tells them not to support. Meanwhile, the restraints placed on them, Ethiopia that is, due to a dictatorship would make them worse off. It's a difficult tightrope to balance between complete failure and semi-successful, but dictatorship generally does not have a good track record. So with imperialism, it really depends on how you do it, but I do think, and I'll be frank with my opinions here, I'm an imperialist. I won't hide it. I'm an imperialist. But it's all about how you do it. For example, do I support our Cold War policy of just establishing dictatorships everywhere just because we're worried about communism? No. Now, do I support intervening to get rid of communism? Oh, heck yes. I just believe they should have been replaced by republics or monarchies with constitutions that protected natural rights of citizens. That's what I wanted. As long as that was achieved, I was fine with you. But instead we went with the Eisenhower route of, oh, sounds like a good time for a dictatorship. Which, hey, it stopped commies. Doesn't mean it was a good policy overall. We had better options. But one might ask, what about self-determination? Is that a good thing? To which I respond, no, it isn't. We have let this decolonization experiment go on for decade upon decade now. And it's gone on for at least 3 decades after superpower intervention. Because before 1991, if you were a post-colonial nation trying to do anything, or if you were a country trying to balance your budget, who'd you turn to? The superpowers, because they were busy competing during the Cold War. Well, that no longer is the case in the 90s, and we saw what they did with that freedom, without the worry of the superpowers coming in. Oh right, they started killing each other. Sudan did this, Ethiopia did this, Somalia is still doing this to some extent, and Libya was a piece of garbage after the revolutions during the Arab Spring left them basically leaderless. Needless to say, we tried self-determination. It didn't work. So we need something new. What I propose, American hegemony. The U.S. intervenes in other countries, guaranteeing them natural rights and economic freedom. In exchange, the U.S. takes over defense, and they compensate us. Said compensation being good trade deals and, if necessary, a small pittance to be used to pay for the army needed. Effectively, it's a better and more effective UN and NATO combined. Taking all the other organizations and just kind of merging them together because clearly they're not doing their freaking jobs well. The UN's supposed to maintain world peace. How's that going in the Middle East right now? Oh yeah, poorly. They failed in the Congo, they failed in Lebanon, they failed currently when dealing with the whole Palestine crisis, and they're failing everywhere else too. The UN cannot maintain world peace. They can't. Neither can NATO because they're limited on where they can act, and they're a defensive alliance for the most part. So, if we truly want a better world, we're going to have to sacrifice something. So, what I propose is sacrificing self-determination. Now, again, with everything I've said, it all depends on how it's implemented. If the US just uses its position to enrich itself in the short term while harming itself in the long term, that is no win. It has to be a long-term plan. The US assuming military responsibility for the world, let's say, and getting economic concessions along with guarantees of liberty from it is a win. But it has to get those. And it can't trust other countries to have militaries because, well, they tend to use them against us most of the time. Unless they're Europe. In which case, we'll flip a coin and depends on which way Germany's going this year. No, I suppose this decade. It really depends. But, yeah. When it comes down to it, you just can't trust them. But at the same time, we need to work with them if we're going to get something done, so setting up a friendly relation with a lot of them based on this hegemony I propose would be, what I can see, the best solution. Also, and I'll end this talk on imperialism here. Sorry if it wasn't that detailed, but I do have a proposal for you. I have basically become the figurehead for a person here because I'm the one who is willing to actually talk and reveal what they sound like, even if I sound like a joke sometimes. But I could always find a way to record a video of me playing video games, or at least the game themselves. So, what if I were to play a video game in relation to politics or grand strategy? Victoria 3 or Suzerain are the options I'm giving you, so if you want to see that, go ahead and tell me. If you don't, I ain't gonna complain. Things happen. Anyways, have a good one, and tell me, do you truly think that given the state of this world, we can honestly trust independent actions to result in the right decisions? Think about it, and get back to me when you come to a conclusion.